Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining today's live webinar. My name is Melissa Glenn. I'm the Interim Director of Education and Training at Northwest Regional Care Association. Today's webinar is titled Building a Culture of Retention. What's the role of data? This is the first event in a two-part regional webinar series and a comprehensive recruitment and retention learning collaborative. This series is offered in collaboration with Region 10 PCAs that includes Oregon PCA, Alaska PCA, Idaho PCA, and Washington Association for Community Health, as well as our subject matter experts from Association of Clinicians for the Underserved STAR 2 Center. So a big thank you to our Region 10 PCA course and training technical assistance specialists, and to ACU for everyone's efforts in designing, planning, and promoting this series. Also, special thanks to my colleague and NWRPCA's workforce specialist, Nate Thomas. So before Nate introduces our presenters, I'd like to give one of our PCA partners an opportunity to greet you. I'm going to turn over the mic to Hannah Heisel from IPCA.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Heisel, and I'm the Program Manager for Workforce Development at the Idaho Primary Care Association. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I wanted to let you know how pleased we are to partner with the region and with ACU to bring this series to everyone. And we hope that you find this to be valuable in your recruitment and retention efforts at your health centers. And I'll speak on behalf of all of the PCAs and say that if you need additional support or technical assistance, please reach out to your state PCA. We stand ready to help. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks for all your efforts in putting this together. Before we start, I'm going to review a few housekeeping items. First is a reminder that this webinar is recorded. It will be posted to NWRPCA's Learning Vault for you to review in the future. Please feel free to share it with colleagues who are not able to join live today. Second is to please post questions that you have in the chat box and make sure that the to line in the chat box says all participants so that read your question. Questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. Third, you'll be invited to complete an evaluation following the presentation, and we want to thank you in advance for your feedback. It's very valuable to us in identifying priorities and providing quality educational opportunities. And then lastly, I want to point out that the views and opinions presented in our program today are those of our invited speakers based on their professional experience and expertise. That being said, I'm going to hand the mic over to Nate Thomas, who is going to introduce our presenters, Allison and Suzanne from ACU STAR 2 Center.
Hello, everyone. This is Nate Thomas here, Workforce Specialist at NWRPCA, and it's my pleasure to introduce the today. Allison is VP for Training and Programs at ACU and Director of the STAR Center. She's an expert in clinical workforce design and strategy and has worked to improve access to care for underserved populations for almost a decade. Suzanne is ACU's Director of Workforce Development. Her main focus is the development of training and materials for the Center. She has worked extensively with state and national partners on workforce issues facing health centers across the nation. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our presenters.
Thanks so much, NWRPCA team, and Hannah as well. We appreciate everyone having us. We appreciate y'all for putting this webinar front and center in your lives today. I know you have a lot to do. I know a lot of pressing business. So we are here to make this fun, snappy, exciting, and really worth your while. I'm thrilled to kind of be kicking off this long-term series on building a culture of retention and talking about my adopted favorite love, which is the role of data there. Here's a cartoon depiction of me. I'm Allison. As Nate mentioned, I'm the VP of Training and Programs here and oversee a lot of our work. I'm also joined on the phone today by my colleague Suzanne Spear, our Director of Workforce Development, and I think Suzanne's going to say hello so you can hear her voice.
Hey, everybody. Excited to be here with you guys.
You're going to hear more from Suzanne on that next webinar that you saw May 7th on compensation. So I'm going to be driving today, and she's going to be available in the chat and Q&A box as things come up throughout our webinar. We are both from the Association of Clinicians for the Underserved. We're really workforce people. We're focused on the recruitment and retention of a transdisciplinary team in solving the access issue. You'll see that we do a lot of different things on recruitment retention. Of course, one of those programs is through funding from the Bureau of Primary Health Care. We're part of a network of 20 organizations that all receive something called National Cooperative Agreements. If you don't know what those are, please Google them because they're a wealth of resources for you. They're all focused on different kinds of things. There are 2 NCAs focused on workforce, a group called Community Health Center, Inc. They do stuff on pipeline and team-based care. And here at ACU, we do things on clinician recruitment and retention. That's right. You heard it here. Free resources on clinician recruitment and retention through our NCA-funded project called the STAR Center. So they're free to you because the Bureau of Primary Health Care has paid for them already through that National Cooperative Agreement I mentioned. So it's not a trick. There's no asterisk later. Lots of resources. So if you take one resource away from today, I hope it's our project website, which is chcworkforce.org. It's very exciting. So don't look at it right now because you might be distracted, and I want you to stay with us. So write it down. You can download these slides from the NWRPCA Vault and check it out later. Now, I could talk about that stuff all day, but we're here for some very specific reasons. We are going to move pretty quickly, so don't be worried. Again, you can download these slides and go through some more detail, but I really want to kind of broad brush explore the role of data in a retention plan. We're going to actually spend a lot of our time in the nitty-gritty reviewing different types of workforce data. And then, of course, giving you some tools to get started. But I do want to start big picture with the concepts of retention. And so, lucky you, this webinar is chock full of polls, and we're going to have Chris launch the very first one, which is just getting a sense of where are you now. So there's a poll that should be open in your WebEx browser. Click the answer that seems right to you and hit submit. So this is about what you think your organization is doing on retention. How do you know if your organization has a culture of retention? Your options are A, I'm not sure. B, well, leadership just kind of feels it out and lets us know where we are. C, we have some major metrics that we use a few of those, something like turnover. Or D, we have some defined goals and strategies to monitor it. So, one, this is going to help me direct some of my comments today as we go, but 2, I want you to take this moment to kind of reflect on where your organization is and where it might need to go as we map out some of these details. So you're going to get 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and Chris can close that poll. And we're going to see the results. Maybe Chris can read them aloud for us. Maybe not. All right, well, we're going to come back to this. Chris, if you can hear me and give us the results later, that would be wonderful. I don't want to hold us up, though, because no matter, what you answered there, I'm sure we have a diversity. Oh, hi, Chris.
Sorry about that. Yeah,
no
yeah,
worries.
it actually was closing the poll, and I wasn't able to talk.
No worries.
It hangs. So anyway, it is closed. You should see the results there.
I do not.
Okay, so I have 4 out of 44 today. 4 are A, 14 are B, 11 is C, and 4 is D.
Okay, great. Thank you. Very helpful. And thanks everyone for participating. I hear we have a lot in that I'm not sure bucket. Hey, that's great. You're at the right place then to kind of explore what you can do. So I want to get us on the same page about how we're going to think about this kind of thing, think about retention today, especially since we have a lot of those I'm not sures. We're talking about building a culture of retention in this series, and so what does that really mean? We have 4 features that we think are kind of the defining characteristics of a culture of retention. So as we read through them, I want you to do kind of a gut check and see if you agree that these are really important. So features of a culture of retention. One, it's engaged. It offers opportunities for two-way communication, both within kind of people's roles as an organization. Number two, it's consistent. Everyone has the same cultural experience no matter what their site is or who their manager is, and this is kind of a very slippery one sometimes. Number three is positive. You may be able to tell by my peppy nature here that I'm a positive person, and of course we had to put that on this list. We really think organizations that are focused on wins and on progress and how the work is creating something positive in the world can help to counteract some of those regular challenges and fatigue we often see. And four, of course, is transparency. That's really where everyone understands where they stand, how they're part of the organization's goals, and how important decisions are made. So you can see that these are just sort of big cultural values, and we think ones that transcend health center size, leadership style, and really more. These four characteristics might look different at each of your health centers, but they should really all be there. Now, there are a lot of ways that you can get to that culture. We listed just a few of these here. This is not an exhaustive list. Recognition events, bonuses, some compensation, professional development opportunities, stay interviews, mission engagement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I really want to point out kind of the linguistic distinction between a couple of the words that get thrown around a lot and ones that we're going to use throughout here, which is the difference between a plan and a strategy. So for today's discussion, we want to talk about a plan as something larger. So a strategy is a specific process that has identified metrics. And that's all those processes I just mentioned: recognition events, stay interviews, mission engagement. And then a plan is a structure that links multiple strategies together. So, of course, the goal is for you to have a plan, whatever that might look like, filled with a series of strategies, no matter what they might be. There's lots of different roads that get us to our final destination. And lots of different things, you know, a plan by any other name, right? Plan can sometimes be stressful for people. Feels like this big written policy that has to be in a binder up on a shelf somewhere that somebody someday is going to come look and say, did you do this or not? But it's really just a structure to understand what you are doing, to track your successes, to identify your failures, to innovate as you can with data, and to, of course, always ensure that you've got alignment with your goal as you go. Now, there are some trademarks of a formal retention plan, which we always encourage. One of them, of course, is that it's written down. That may seem obvious, but sometimes it can be more of a, oh, yeah, I know we rolled out that process and we have it written down somewhere, but it's not all together. So it's got to be written down. It's got to be regularly evaluated. And again, it has to be connected to larger organizational benchmarks. So it can feel kind of tricky to put that together if you don't have data backing you up. And this is where we make that switch and we say, Allison, I understand it. What's the connection between data and a retention plan? Oh, my favorite quote probably of all time. Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. I use this in my work and also with my family. I wonder how many of you have sat around a table with your team trying to come up with a set of strategies, and everyone has their own ideas about what's important or what would work or what would not work. We all have experiences, different experiences. But data is the way out of that tangle, or it's at least a way to navigate through it. So let me understand where y'all are with that as of today. I hear that there's a lot of unsure where we're at kind of with our overall data approach. Let's try another poll to kind of understand what your organization does in terms of collecting workforce data specifically. So we've got another I'm not sure option again. That's A. Again, feel free to use that I'm not sure. There's no one right or wrong answer. You could say, oh, we're not there yet. We've sort of thought about it, but haven't really put anything into practice. C, yes, we do some basics. And so that's, maybe we have a couple things we look at annually. I'm going to mention turnover again because that's a big one for folks. Or D, yes, and we're practically experts. So no wrong answer here again, but it will help me figure out who to call on later.
We're
So
at 60%.
Great. So everybody take your next 5 seconds, no time to waste, make your voice heard, et cetera, and then we're going to have Chris close out the poll and read out the answers to us.
Okay. Closing the poll. Just bear with me. Actually finishes out with the remaining responses.
We should have known. Technology always takes some time.
Yeah, it takes a little bit here. 5 seconds. Okay. So we have 1 out of 45. I'm not sure. That's B. I'm sorry, that's A. B is 9. C is 19. D is 3.
Okay, interesting. Thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate that, and appreciate y'all answering. I see we lost some of you in there. Don't stick with me now. I know it's probably lunchtime where you are, so don't get too far from that keyboard. But it sounds like we have a lot of folks that are in the basics column, and that's where we sort of assumed a lot of you all would be. This is tricky, and we want to talk through it. So, you know, what are we talking about when we're talking about workforce data and retention strategies specifically? There are a couple of pieces about what we'll call good data, although all data is a little bit troubling, which is that it should be as specific as much as possible and, frankly, as real time as much as possible if you want to really check things out. It should be connected to bottom line and larger issues at your organization, and it should offer opportunity for more exploration. So a sample, use case example process for a health center that's looking at data would kind of go through these major questions. What is happening at the organization, site, and individual levels? Where are things going well? Always nice to know about your successes. Where are the problem spots? And again, this is where really specific data can help you narrow down, oh, it's a problem with this type of discipline at this specific site that's working for this specific manager, that kind of detail. What are the root causes of the problems? I just mentioned managers. They're, as you all know, something that definitely plays a role in why people stay or why they leave, but trying to figure out as much as you can with the information that you can, what's really causing some of those problems. Even identifying what additional info you might need. That's always helpful because it helps kind of illuminate the process for you. And then, of course, big things that we want to highlight as we're talking about moving forward is, what solutions can we test through some kind of a PDSA, that's a Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle. I'm going to talk more about that later, as well as what do we tackle next. And how are we going to keep moving forward? Unfortunately, QI is an ongoing thing. You don't get to just do it once. So the whole piece of this is you're not just collecting data for data's sake. You're collecting data so you can figure out what are some specific measurable issues you can address, and how are your current strategies collectively leading to progress on those issues. Now, there's a bunch of different kinds of data. We really focus on 3 types of data you can and really should use to assess the efficacy of your retention strategies and your overall retention plan. I'm going to give you a non-comprehensive list of these specific metrics, and then we're going to walk through a sample use case. So you can kind of see basically what I'm talking about in all areas and then go deeper in a sample. Remember that you can always come back to the slides for all the details, and our goal is to really paint the broad strokes for you, let you walk away with a basic picture and some understanding of where you might want to go. So we are going to start with organizational data. Hooray! This is data that tells you about the experience of working in your organization. So we focus here on clinicians. I know you heard me say earlier that we're clinician recruitment retention folks through the STAR Center. But there are loads more metrics you could select if you were looking at other types of staff. But in general, this organizational type piece, the things we're going to talk about are going to tell you a little bit about who's staffed at your organization and what the practice experience is. So, of course, because it's the big thing everybody wants to talk about all the time, we've got competitive salary here. So data points for you kind of in this bucket of things would be salaries compared to local market by discipline or by staff type, and then also the value of your total benefits package compared to the local market. The concern that we're reviewing that data for is basically a major inability to retain many different types of clinicians. And so maybe if you start to look at those two data points, you start to see your concern, which is, oh, looks like we're having our salary and benefits package is really low in the market for these specific types of clinicians, or again, this would work for other staff as well. So from there, you would answer some of those questions that we projected earlier, and really focus your strategy to deal with those things is to focus on maybe identifying improved compensation and also communicating the value of your existing benefits. So that's how we're going to do this. We've got the data point, the concerns, and the strategy. Now, there's lots of different things that you can do a deep dive on here, even that I mentioned, so salary compared to local market. How can you figure that out? There's lots of different resources depending on where you specifically are. There's information through PCAs often, through your state PCA, sometimes through your regional PCA, through national organizations like the National Association of Community Health Centers. There's also for-profit groups that do things. MGMA is an example of one of those. So there's lots of different ways to get at the data point I'm mentioning here, but the idea is basically that you have a sense of how you're doing compared to other people. How competitive is your salary? Another big data point under organizational data is National Health Service Corps utilization. So National Health Service Corps, as you all are very aware, is a federal loan repayment and scholarship program focused on different types of clinicians. We at ACU are big National Health Service Corps folks. We were founded by NHSC alumni, and so of course it's important to us because we understand really that NHSC folks sometimes operate differently than other types of clinicians. Maybe they have higher turnover rates, or maybe they're in more of a locked-in cycle when you know you can get them depending on the specifics of the program. So we'd really like all health centers to have a good sense of the percentage of the NHSC clinicians by discipline and by site. So the concern here is not that, oh, you shouldn't have so many NHSC folks. The concern is really that there's potential high turnover based on some basic research on what National Health Service Corps clinicians tend to do related to their service term. And there's also concerns about perhaps too many quote-unquote new professionals. So depending on what kind of folks you can get using NHSC, your organization might be staffed so there's a lot of people who have fewer years of practice experience and so don't have a lot of in-house mentors. Some strategies, depending on what you find with that kind of data point, are really to focus on engagement as much as you can and coming up with a plan for support and ongoing training. So that's an example of maybe if you looked at the data point and said, oh, hey, at this site, you know, 80% of our nurse practitioners are actually through National Health Service Corps scholarship or loan repayment, and most of them are within 5 years of entering practice. So how are we going to come up with some kind of ongoing training and support plan to help them make sure that they don't get too burned out or overwhelmed and want to stay here? Next data point is staffing structures, and this is really looking at that data point, which is the ratio of full-time to part-time staff by discipline. You know, our concern here is not that there's a specific ratio that's right. You have to have a certain amount of full-time staff or a certain amount of part-time staff. It's really to understand why it's there. So sometimes this happens because there's not really a plan and there's an underlying recruitment and retention issue. So maybe you're looking at this and you're saying, oh, actually we have a lot of part-time people at one or two of our sites, and it turns out that that's there not because we used it to retain those people, but because we couldn't actually recruit the people that we wanted. And so kind of understanding those staffing structures, you can evaluate where it's working and identify ways to fold it into an attractive package and kind of use it more intentionally to communicate the benefits of your culture. For example, flexibility. A lot of our positions are part-time, either part-time or job share. That's the kind of thing where the data can just help you tell your story better to potential candidates or to existing staff. And the last one we want to cover in this section is productivity expectations. You're probably not surprised to hear me say this, and likely you guys review this in terms of a financial and a clinical aspect. We hope that you'll review it in terms of Workforce One as well. The data point, of course, is visits per FTE, full-time equivalent, by discipline. we want you to look at that, look at your expectations for folks, and really consider whether or not they may be contributing to an exhausting practice experience and burnout. Of course, we know that there's a line between revenue people need to generate in order to keep the organization going, but also there are lines because clinicians, as it turns out, are people. And they're doing their best, certainly, but you want to understand how your productivity expectations are impacting individuals. And this is a good example of where you may start big picture and connect something like this to say, oh, all the providers at this one site had these certain productivity expectations, and I can see that they're maybe higher than ones from this other site. So let's compare this data point with another data point, something like turnover, to see if we think that's connected or not. You can't always suss out causality with a lot of these data points, but you can get a good sense of maybe these things are working together or not, and of course always open the door for just more conversations. You can see that strategy here, which is, hey, this data point provides an opportunity for conversation between the CMO and the CFO, or between providers and teams. Every data point is like a little suitcase that you have to unpack and figure out what it means and how it's connected to other things and how you might be able to use it. And I know that might sound a little exhausting, and maybe it is, but really it's about having deeper understanding with your staff and creating that culture of engagement that we're talking about, showing that you are looking into the things that you can look at, opening conversations about those things, and doing what you can to make it a more positive environment. That's a big hallmark of a culture of retention. So we want to talk now about human resources data. I could have gone on and on about organizational data, but the clock's a-ticking, and we want you to get a good sense of what other types of things are out there. So, of course, human resources data. Now, this is a big one that you may think the most of when you think of workforce metrics. And so we have about 4 things in here we want to cover. Again, not comprehensive, but gives you a good sense of what is out there and what we mean by certain types of data. And of course, I'm going to start with the one I've mentioned a couple times already, which is turnover. So this data point is the number of people who leave in a year by discipline, also by site, but I don't want to put too much on you right now. This is going to give you a good sense of by discipline and by site, where potentially some of those problem areas are and key disciplines you might want to target, as well as key teams or sites that you might want to target. A lot of challenges with organizational level data is that it's organizational level, and so it doesn't give you a good sense necessarily at a site level when there might be a specific issue. An example would be, everybody who works at this one site, all the MAs who work at this one site have a much higher turnover than MAs who work at other sites. So what's going on at that site? Or, hey, we're having a lot harder time retaining our physician assistants than we are retaining our physicians or nurse practitioners. Something as much as you can to figure out, this is not just a generic turnover number for the organization. That stuff sounds kind of sexy when you're going out into the community with your partners and talking about, here's our turnover rate. You really need a very specific turnover rate that you can cut and dice and look at a lot of different ways. That's going to give you a process for understanding the highest turnover and help you come up with a plan to address a given issue. We really recommend giving yourself a year to address something like that. So turnover is really important. The other side of that same coin is tenure, and that's your length of employment for each individual by discipline. This is a nice one because it's really focused on success stories, and you get to look at the tenure for a lot of different staff and say, great, who's staying a really long time? Do we see any themes? Do we see any trends? Let's actually talk to them. There's that unpacking of the suitcase again. Let's talk with them about what's going well. Why have they stayed so long? What have we given them that have kept them? And also, what more could we give them to keep them longer? You can find some successful strategies that have worked for you across sites, across disciplines, across managers, and figure out how to replicate those throughout your organization. We want to talk also about absence trends, and that would be absence rates per individual and per team. These tend to be a lot of the high target positions, folks like front desk staff, coding, billing, MAs, any group that has regular maybe turnover or absence. The idea here is you can start to identify disengaged staff or teams. So if one person all of a sudden you see a spike in absence rate by team or by site, that's when you can actually have an intervention before it becomes full turnover or a larger problem. So this is an example of a type of data point that you would really want to be real time, so you can come up with interventions to address them as you go. And we want to close this section out with, of course, money, staffing revenues, and expenses. This is a good one for your entire sort of workforce team as you're discussing things. You know, one big metric here is the cost to recruit each discipline. In general, you may have a workforce budget, but it would be great if you use some tools, and we have some available, to say, hey, every time we recruit a physician or an MA or a nurse practitioner or a dentist, it costs us this much money. And part of that is also understanding your revenue per employee, and that's, of course, usually only providers or people who can bill. But how much money you're bringing in for each of those people, and how much is it costing you to recruit somebody new? Whether or not it's a vacancy or a brand new position, it's good to have a real understanding of that bottom line. That's going to indicate for you how much a vacancy really costs and the impact of turnover on that bottom line. So you can figure out how to weigh alternatives to a full vacancy and identify the value of investing in retention efforts. And so what I mean by that is if you say, hey, every time we have to recruit a nurse practitioner, it costs us this much money, and based on our other metrics that we've covered, we're having to recruit this many nurse practitioners every year or every other year, what if we put a percentage of that money towards some of these retention activities and strategies we really want to try out? So getting a sense of how each of these pieces, workforce pieces, is connected to that bottom line is going to help you figure out how much you can invest in some retention strategies and other types of things that you'd like to try out. This is an example of how there's lots of different kinds of metrics that you're going to use for a lot of different types of things. Feel free to, as you're going, sketch down some ideas that say, oh, we really want to address this type of data point, or this is the kind of question we need a data point to answer, and you can kind of work backwards that way. In the meantime, we're going to move on to partner data. By partner data, I really mean kind of outsider partner folks that are in your community, on your team, not internal, but folks that you have to consider when you're making big decisions about recruitment or retention. There are three main things here I want to highlight. The first one is competitor plans, and that data point, and really all these metrics, are less of the quantitative numeric data points that you're going to find in the organizational and HR metrics we've talked about. But there are things like this. A competitor's plans to expand or change. So maybe an example is a hospital in your area has decided they're going to add a walk-in clinic for primary care next year. Knowing that, understanding how big that's going to be, what their goals are, any data that you can collect on that is going to help you identify something like increased competition for staff. Because if somebody's opening a similar type of practice in your neighborhood, chances are they want somebody who's already doing something like that, which is, dun, 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 your current staff. So maybe it'll be competition to keep your current staff. Maybe you'll both be recruiting a new type of person. You have an anticipated vacancy. You know they're going to be recruiting. The idea here is really to identify some quote-unquote weak points and focus on staff engagement, especially of those folks that you think you might be at risk of losing. This is, again, another something that should be incorporated real time so you can react to the environment and respond appropriately. We have competitors, but we also have funders. We love funders. These are folks, it can be hard to keep track of sometimes, and a lot of y'all have grant writers or other folks who are actively doing it, but you want to make sure it's incorporated into your workforce efforts by understanding things like the dates and amounts of potential funding opportunities or partners. The idea is really that you have the ability to respond if opportunities arise. So maybe you know your primary care office or a local foundation or somebody else is really caring about a certain workforce issue or a certain population, and you think they might have opportunities for you to invest in staff. As much as you can, and we know it's hard to find the time, but something like developing a few proposals that can be quickly ready if some of those opportunities arrive, or at least you have outlines that you're regularly talking with folks about to make sure that you're able to respond to that environmental change and make the most of it. And of course, we have our community partner priorities as well. So those folks would be folks like primary care offices, primary care associations, other health organizations in your community, education nonprofits, all those types of people. You want to figure out what are some of the regional initiatives or issues that those groups are focusing on. The idea is that you use that data to find opportunities to partner and leverage resources as you go along. This is, you'll hear a theme here, part of an ongoing need for regular conversations and real-time data on your shared goals. And having that full written retention plan that has all those retention strategies in it, that's going to help you have these conversations in a really productive way. And all the other data metrics that we're talking about are ways that you can demonstrate people that you have a data-informed approach to your investments and to your efforts. And so keeping all of this partner data as part of the regular working conversation in relation to workforce recruitment and retention specifically is really the idea here. Then you'll have all of these different things. Maybe you don't have all of the ones I mentioned. Maybe you have a bunch of different ones from the ones I mentioned. Maybe you only have a couple in each bucket. But the idea, again, is that you get to this big goal. You can answer these questions. What are some specific measurable issues you can address? And how are your strategies collectively leading to progress on those issues? The idea is not to make your life harder. It's to help you really understand when it's worth investing in something. You all do this all the time with different business cases, with your quality improvement initiatives, but this is really about, hey, we know we want to keep people. We're ready to invest in that. We're going to help data take us there. So that, of course, leads me to that Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle I mentioned earlier for retention processes. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about how you're actually going to use these data when you're implementing new strategies, because I have a lot of ideas for strategies you can use. So do the experts from the PCAs on the phone and lots of others out there. A lot of you are doing great, interesting retention strategies. But the idea is that data becomes part of those strategies and part of the process you're using to figure out what works for your specific organization and your sites and not just for anyone else. So we've included a link here to a great write-up and template, but the basic concept of Plan, Do, Study, Act is that you plan an activity, you do it, you collect data as you go, you study that data, and then you act. You revise that plan, and then you go all the way around again. So this is kind of a continuous QI loop as you go. For retention processes, there are some key questions you need to kind of ask as you're going through that PDSA cycle. You're asking, what are we testing? What do we predict will happen and why? Who's going to be involved? What's our timeline? What resources do we need? What data do we need? You do all that. You actually act on it. You study them. What happened? How does it compare to the predictions? And where do we go from here? And that's where your act comes in. So we wanted to walk through a quick example of this process in motion with something called stay interviews. So in case you're not familiar, stay interviews really use the concept of exit interviews. As you know, exit interviews are those things we ask people a bunch of probing questions about their satisfaction and what they cared about and why it was hard for them and what they did like when they've already quit. The concept of stay interviews is that you wait and you say, hey, before you leave, we want to ask you all those same questions to figure out what we can do better to keep you here while we do have you and while we have an opportunity to intervene in things. So here's an example of how an organization has used this PDSA cycle when they decided to test stay interviews. Said, what are we testing? Hey, let's try and work these stay interviews into our processes. They said, what do we predict will happen and why? So this health center said, well, we think we're going to find more actionable issues, and in general, we're going to increase engagement because people feel valued and listened to. Who was going to be involved in that? This health center decided that their CEO would be, their CMO, and all managers of basically all types of people. So they figured they'd have all these people come together and work on this project. Of course, all other staff who needed to be interviewed would also be involved, but they thought these set of people would have the most impact to their time and resources. They also said, hey, let's give it 1 year to do this. This is a lot of work. We're a relatively small health center, but we're new to this, so let's set a pretty aggressive goal of 1 year to get through all of these and to get through this whole PDSA cycle on this. The resources question was the big one. So they needed an interview template. It's best for these stay interviews if everyone gets asked the same types of questions. And they're fun questions, don't worry. It's things like, if you had a magic wand, what would you change here and why? So they needed that interview template. They needed time together to come up with that and come up with a list of questions they thought were right for everybody. They had to provide training for managers on that, how to do a stay interview, how to respond to questions, what they should set in terms of expectations, how long they should last, all that kind of thing. Then they needed everybody to get time on their staff schedule. Then they needed a mechanism for reporting issues found. So if these stay interviews were taking place over a period of 6 months. And so it was really about, hey, if there's an immediate pressing issue that we find, how are managers going to report that up to leadership to deal with it right away? Because we're going to have a formal evaluation plan later, and that's that last bit, a plan to address things. But how are we going to deal with things as we're finding them real time? So this health center came up with like a survey monkey that they kept open and all the managers had a link to, and they could record any immediate issues. And then they also had a report template to fill out after conducting each interview template that got submitted via email to their managers. Then, of course, was that last plan to address what we find, which is it's great to collect information about what people like or don't like or are struggling with, but you really have to do something about it after you do that. So they collected all of this information. They did have a short anonymous survey I mentioned for participants and managers to go through. A lot of that was some more, check all that apply or list the things, and then it was a mix of short answer, as well as kind of an ongoing tracker for issues. So the leadership team could check in about this every month, even if they weren't going to do the full review until the end. So what happened? That was a big part of that final debrief. They said, wow, there are a lot more issues than we thought, but we did find a theme throughout the entire organization and pockets of themes at different sites. And so this was a pretty valuable experience because we have a clearer idea of why people are happy or unhappy depending on where they are. And we have a clear sense of what was common things that we as an organization need to really work on. How does this compare to our predictions? The health center said, well, people want faster change than we can really give them. So it might be increasing frustration. We thought that giving the state interviews was a chance for them to share and engage with us, but what we're finding is maybe people are saying, hey, now that I've told you about it, I want action on this right now. And so this health center, as an example, had to come up with a formal response plan to folks to help them understand this is what we're doing with your information, this is how fast we're able to act, this is our basic timeline. And that was their go from here. They wanted to make a plan to address some of those big themes in the issues. A lot of it, for example, was around communication from leadership, and so they focused on a number of strategies that they could incorporate for the next 6 months to communicate what they were doing with the stay interview process and where they were going big picture on some other things like newsletters and other pieces. And they decided to do this again next year, so that was also part of their strategy to say, hey, we loved hearing from you, this is how we're working on things, and we want to keep doing this. So as I mentioned, QI is an ongoing process. This health center went through this whole cycle and then did it again the next year, collected all the data, and refined their process and did it all again the next year. But it really shows you how someone has to be in the driver's seat for this type of work. It takes some time, absolutely. The stay interviews are one example of something that actually is pretty resource intensive from a manager's perspective in terms of organizing all of this. But even this whole process, somebody has to design this process. Somebody has to answer some of these questions. Somebody has to be the driver of scheduling the meetings and putting as a priority follow-up on these things. And so I'd really like to hear from you as you're kind of taking all this in, who at your organization is empowered to do this kind of work? Chris has just opened another poll, and so when you're thinking about that whole process of, wow, that's how an organization used some data to test out a process, who at our organization could do that? Maybe you have a C-suite level staffer focused on workforce, someone like a chief workforce officer or chief people officer or a VP of development, someone like that. Maybe your leadership team and others share the responsibility for this kind of thing, and you would need to work it into an overall strategic plan. Maybe it's someone from your HR team, an HR director or a set of HR folks, depending on the size of your organization. Or maybe you think, oh, we don't really have anyone who has time to do this. And that's also important to know. This is the kind of thing that's important and it's great and can be relatively easy to just get going on. I don't want you to think that it's not. But you do have to actually make it a priority to designate some time. And so if your answer here is D, this is a good time to reflect and say, wow, how important is this? And how can we go about having an internal conversation to actually designate someone to deal with that? So, Chris, you can go ahead and close that poll. I hope, folks, while Chris is closing that poll, you can take some time, write down this question, think about it, figure out really, who on your team is part of it. If you're somebody who's excited by this work, hopefully you coming to this webinar is an example of that, you can really think about, wow, what kind of time would I need to even investigate some of these issues, and how do I have that conversation with my manager? So, Chris, if you could read out the answers, that'd be great.
Yep. Poll is just finished up. A is 1, B is 12, C is 9, D is 4.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chris, and thanks for everyone who participated. Sounds like the leadership team and others kind of share the responsibility for a lot of that work for a majority of you, followed closely by someone from our HR team. So interesting, I think that's pretty common for what we find. We would very much advocate for someone in A, in that C-suite level, who has both the time, the expertise, and the decision-making resources behind them to kind of do this kind of effort. But you don't have to have that. There's a lot that you guys can do as teams or somebody can do with your team support. And that's really what we want to talk about as you're submitting your questions in chat and Q&A is, well, what do I do now? Allison, you've been talking a lot, really fast, about a lot of big issues, and where do we go from here? So, of course, we hope that you have a better sense of what kinds of data I'm talking about when I'm talking about workforce data, and you have a better sense of how you might use that data as part of a retention strategy. But, of course, we want you to bring these big questions to your leadership team or that HR director who's managing this type of work and just kind of see what the answers to these are. And I do mean literally, please, schedule a meeting and just work through these questions. Remember, you can get these slides from the NWR PCA Vault. Questions. What does our retention plan look like today? Remember, that retention plan is that written structure of that collection of strategies. What metrics can we connect to our current plan? So maybe you have metrics already available. A lot of you said you had some basic metrics. How are those connected to that written retention plan? What additional metrics do our systems provide? So a lot of those HR metrics I mentioned are automatically collected or can be regularly collected if you set it up right through your payroll systems. So I mentioned that it's easy sometimes to dive into this, and that's a great example of how it's easy. Sometimes these things are already in your systems, and it's just a matter of looking for them or setting it up and then collecting and making it part of your processes. Another big question, what do our managers think we should start with? It's a great way to stop for a moment and get engagement from folks. Data is not the end-all, be-all. It's just the start of that conversation. It's just a suitcase to unpack. So find out what you can find and then talk to your managers and say, hey, what do you think are the big issues here? Or what big workforce data would you like to have that would make your day and your life easier? And then, of course, you want to answer that big question, which is who can focus on this work. So the answers to all of these are really going to help illuminate what you have, what is a priority for you next, what resources you have for this work, and how to do something actionable. Always, always answer big questions related to your goals before you do a deep dive into the little details. Details are so fun and can be very exciting, and you think, oh, I would love to figure out what the numbers are on that site and figure out what their turnover data and tenure data is. But really you want to start with these big questions. There is no sense in driving down a data highway that's going to be a dead end for your organization in terms of where you've invested that time. Figure out what's going to work for you and for your organization and start there. That's the most important thing. Of course, we have some resources available to you. I want to mention these 4 things. Again, these are linked, and Chris has put the link to the vault in the chat for you to see. We have data profiles. So ACU every year creates a recruitment and retention data profile for every health center and lookalike using nationally available data sets a lot, for example, from UDS, Uniform Data System information, but also from other things like the National Survey on Drug Use in Health. We've been doing those every year as PDFs. This year we're just finalizing transitioning that to a very exciting Tableau system online so you can really play and compare your data with groups of other health centers. So almost every organizational data metric that I mentioned there, as well as many, many others, are available on that data profile. So if you're looking for an easy way to jump into that part of the pool, the data profiles are a place to start. I also wanted to share with you the financial impact tool, and that is a downloadable Excel calculator for you to get to that metric on the cost of recruitment. You're going to fill in a bunch of fields. It's going to tell you how much it costs you to recruit the type of clinician that you put in there. So that's one of those metrics I mentioned today, and one that you can calculate using that tool right now. We have a new strategic planning workbook and accompanying archived webinar. That's going to cover a lot of the partner type data that I talked about, and will help you figure out how to facilitate those conversations with partners and with your board too on how you're going to incorporate that data more real time into your workforce practice. And lastly, I want to mention the Health Center Resource Clearinghouse. That is an effort of all 20 of those groups that receive a national cooperative agreement, and it's a collection of a bunch of our resources. So again, we're clinician recruitment retention people, but there's also other strategic planning and workforce resources available on that Resource Clearinghouse. It's linked in the slide. You can also get it at healthcenterinfo.org. Coming soon, we have an in-depth learning collaborative focused on HR metrics and a very thrilling web-based turnover analysis tool that's going to help you identify, you're going to put in some pieces on turnover, and it's going to help you identify your rates and part of the financial impact to your organization on that. There's a lot we do on this topic and a lot that's available to you for, yes, that's true, $0. So please check us out. I also want to say a special welcome and congratulations to the Region 10 Learning Collaborative. It starts next week, officially, the Learning Collaborative sessions. You lucky folks are going to be doing a deep dive into everything I've been talking about today. We're going to do 30 minutes a week to help you develop a plan to address a lot of those data points that I've talked through. So congratulations. If you are hearing about that and you feel really sad that you didn't get to join in, don't worry. We're going to do another Learning Collaborative experience with our friends in Region 10 in the fall. But for all those in the Learning Collaborative, check your emails for your welcome packet, figure out how to join us, and we'll look forward to doing more of that deeper dive starting next week. So as you put in your questions to the Q&A in the chat box boxes. I'm going to have Chris open the last poll, which is helping you focus all this energy and information into some kind of plan. So what might be your next priority in collecting, analyzing workforce data? I want to see where a lot of you ended up after talking today. Of course, we have option A, which is crying a little and then taking a nap, which is kind of funny, kind of true. It's what I did many years ago when I started getting involved in this work. B, maybe you're going to focus on figuring out what kind of capacity you have for this. That would be, folks, if you plan to look at those big organizational questions I mentioned a couple of slides ago. C would be taking a closer look at the data we already have. So maybe you're one of those folks who said, yep, we have a lot of this kind of data. We're going to focus on it, and now we're going to go back and do a deeper dive. Or D, getting more info on how to analyze and make our current data actionable. So make your final selection, and we'll have Chris go ahead and close that last poll of the day. We want to kind of see where you ended up. Again, that's going to help us figure out what resources you might want. Us at ACU and those at the PCA can kind of identify some of those things and see what kind of information you might want in terms of support, resources, additional training, etc. So Chris, when you're ready, if you could read out the answers, we'll see where people ended up, and then we'll officially answer any questions we received.
Allison, this is Melissa. I am going to read those responses. We're waiting a few more seconds for the poll to tally up. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Still thinking here, just about done.
Okay, well, thanks. While that's telling, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat or Q&A box. I'm not going to say it hurts my feelings because I'm just going to assume it's because I've wowed you and answered all of your questions. But now's your last chance in our last minute or so. If you have any questions, immediate things you want to hear from, happy to talk through that.
And while people are typing, I can give our poll results.
Great.
The great news is that no one is crying or taking
No one's crying. Great. I'm so happy. Hooray.
It looks like 9 people are figuring out what kind of capacity they have. That's B. 10 people are taking a closer look at what data they already have. That's C. And then 20 people are coming in at D, getting more info about how to analyze and make data actionable.
Wonderful. I'm happy to hear so many of you are in those last 2 buckets together. Thank you, Melissa, for sharing that, and thank you all for participating in that poll. I do want to say, really, if you go back to this list of questions, no matter which bucket you're in that last question, really take these, literally sit down with your team, answer them, and see where you end up. And then, of course, you can come to our website at chcworkforce.org, get all those resources I mentioned, and, of course, reach out to your primary care associations. Always, always. They have lots of resources and lots of capacity to bring folks together to have more conversation about this issue. So with that, looks like we have 1 minute to spare, and one thank you from Colleen. Thank you, Colleen, for your kind attention. Melissa, I'll let you close it out for us.
Closing it out, I just wanted to thank everyone who joined for being with us today, all the participants. Just a quick reminder that you can find the slides for this presentation in our Learning Vault. The link was given in the chat by Chris, and we hope for the next webinar. Thanks everyone for joining. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.